Hi everyone and welcome to Truth Over News. Billionaire Mark Cuban recently got into a lengthy debate on X with Christopher Rufo over the premise behind DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The exchange was fascinating and the points made by Rufo were brilliant. But during the back and forth, Cuban made several statements that illustrated a fundamental misunderstanding of our Constitution. Although we were taken aback at Cuban's claim that it would be terrifying and problematic for the president to have authority over the federal bureaucracy, given that the Constitution explicitly grants the president this power, we were more alarmed at the number of people who thought Cuban was correct. This total misunderstanding of our Constitution is precisely what's enabled the bureaucratic agency establishment, or deep state, allowing it to thrive and prosper. Which is why we found it disturbing that so many agreed with Cuban's misinterpretation of the most basic elements of our Constitution. Separation of power in our government is one of the most fundamental tenets of our great Constitution. Our founders realized the great harm that could be done if our government wasn't designed to be as decentralized as possible. Why? Because when power is consolidated in the hands of the few, the needs of the many are ignored. Our founding fathers recognized this great trap and sought to put in place lasting safeguards against the natural tendency of the federal government to capture and accrue undue political power. Safeguards that sought the preservation of individual and state rights against the natural process of power consolidation at the federal level. It's the very reason we are a republic as opposed to a democracy, also known as dictatorship by the majority. It's why we are a republic with a constitutionally limited government. And it's why governmental powers are separated between three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. At its core, a democracy is ruled by the majority. This is the singular defining feature. Stated another way, it is majority over man. In a democracy, we the people are viewed as a group rather than individuals. The purpose of a democratic constitution is to empower the majority of the people to rule over the minority. Again, a dictatorship by the majority. Our founding fathers were acutely aware of the dangers inherent in a pure democracy, including their tendency to self-destruct. As John Adams wrote, there is never a democracy that did not commit suicide. Thankfully for us, our founders arrived on an appropriate solution, which they enshrined into our Constitution under Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. It is in our willingness to live by our Republican Charter, the Constitution of the United States, that allows us to maintain our freedom. Our founding fathers were looking for a structure that could protect the individual and the states while avoiding the madness of crowds. As the Heritage Foundation observed, they wanted a form of government that draws authority from the people while being able to act independently of and against their majoritarian excesses. But a delicate balance had to be struck. As James Madison argued, not only that all power should be derived from the people, but that those entrusted with it should be kept in dependence on the people by a short duration of their appointments, and that even during this short period, the trust should be placed not in a few, but a number of hands. Our founders understood that a democracy is only as free as the majority's understanding and application of the term freedom, which is precisely why we are a constitutional republic, a republic with a constitutionally limited government. In a republic, political authority comes from the people. Powers are vested in the people and are exercised through representatives chosen by the people who make decisions on their behalf. Republics are bound by charters, which limit the responsibilities and powers of the state. The purpose of a Republican charter, our Constitution, is to secure the individual's rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And just as the government is established to secure those pre-existing rights of the individual, governmental power is then limited to protect the individual from the government through laws that govern those who govern us. Crucially, people have and maintain natural, inalienable rights, and people and their rights are protected by the Bill of Rights from the majority. Indeed, the recognition of our inalienable rights is precisely why our Constitution is a charter of negative rights. A right of any kind conveys an action or a non-action onto others, which is why there are two types of rights, negative and positive. A negative right is the requirement of abstention from an activity which violates another individual's rights, the requirement of a non-action. I am forbidden from acting in a manner which takes away your life. Positive rights are the opposite. A positive right is the requirement to engage in an activity to secure another individual's rights. Positive rights require an action from us on behalf of another individual. I must contribute some of my labor, taxes, to pay for someone else's right, health care. Our Constitution is fundamentally built on the notion of negative rights or negative obligations. Why is this? Because negative rights stem from the only fundamental right, the right to life. No one else has the right to take my life, and all other rights, including property and control over the benefits of one's labor, spring from this most basic of rights. Which brings us to perhaps the single greatest differentiation between conservatives and liberals, one that perhaps exceeds even our differences on being driven by logic rather than from emotion. Conservatives believe our Constitution is founded on certain inalienable rights, and as such is fixed and timeless. Inalienable rights are those rights which are incapable of being taken away, denied, transferred, or surrendered to another. Inalienable rights are eternal. These rights were the same 1,000 years ago, and they will be the same 1,000 years from now. Liberals, by contrast, believe in a living constitution, one that changes and progresses with time. From this vantage point, there are no inalienable rights. Rights under a living constitution can be taken away at any point, which is effectively the same as having no constitution at all. Our nation's electoral college is intrinsically tied into our status as a constitutional republic. The Electoral College was established for two primary purposes. First, it was meant as a meaningful conciliatory gesture to the people. Remember, we are a republic, to allow for our more direct participation in the election of the president. Secondly, and more importantly, the Electoral College was put in place to protect states' rights and those of the individuals residing in them. Our founders foresaw the growth and territorial expansion of the United States and therefore provided the Electoral College as the mechanism that kept power from remaining firmly entrenched in already populated places like Boston and New York. The Electoral College helps maintain our federal system of government in which our national government's power is balanced by the governmental power of the states. Each state's political autonomy to directly serve its own citizens is also enhanced. The House of Representatives was designed to represent states based on their population. There are currently 435 seats being assigned to states based on proportional population counts every 10 years in our national census. The number of House seats is not fixed, but has inexplicably remained unchanged for more than 100 years, a grave mistake unto itself. These electoral votes are assigned to the states roughly evenly according to population. The Senate, by contrast, represents each state regardless of population, so every state gets 2 electoral votes automatically, no matter its population. Therefore, voters in small states have significantly greater clout per electoral vote as they represent a greater proportion of that state's electoral vote versus a more populous state. As a quick example, our smallest state by population, Wyoming, has about 3 times the electoral clout per voter than the national average because their 3 electoral votes, 1 House, 2 Senate, is split amongst their 2020 census count of only 575,000 people. Florida, by contrast, has the smallest voting power per capita in the Electoral College vote. Although the Electoral College raises complaints every election cycle, this disparity is very much by design to protect the smaller states and their residents from the political power of the larger states, who nevertheless hold far greater political clout due entirely to their much larger populations. If you start from a premise of protecting the rights of the individual, the Electoral College makes perfect sense. The electoral process helps dictate that no single region contains the 270 electoral votes that are required to elect a president. It's also a reason why presidents often select a vice president from a different region from their own. Candidates are required to form a loose and broad coalition of varying states and regions, as opposed to promoting regional differences in order to win the presidency. And minority votes matter, given the winner-take-all basis used by virtually all states. Maine and Nebraska are the exceptions. A small minority vote can mean the difference in the entire electoral votes of a particular state. The Electoral College is an integral and intertwined part of your individual rights, and is an inherent protection of those rights, and the rights of states as well. It's the issue of states' rights that brings us to the 17th Amendment, which provided for the popular election of senators by the people of each state. Prior to the amendment, senators were elected by each state's legislature rather than by a popular vote. There were very specific reasons why our founding fathers created this structure. Under the original framing of the Constitution, the people of each state elected the House members, and the legislature of each state elected the Senate members. House members served 2 years, and Senate members served 6 years. The shorter term of the House members ensured that they would be held accountable to the people's daily or current issues. The longer 6-year term of the senators meant that they could remain more detached from populism, allowing for senators to take longer views on issues. The original structure also ensured that the House and Senate were each responsible to separate constituencies. Prior to the 17th Amendment, senators were intrinsically linked to their home state's interests. Since senators were elected by state legislatures, they were directly responsible to those same state legislatures. If a senator began to vote against the interests of the state he represented, he could immediately be recalled. This system prevented undue influence of special interests at the congressional level. This cannot be stated strongly enough. States, not special interests, held the greatest sway and control over a senator's votes. The underlying premise was simple. States are better equipped to understand and respond to the needs of their citizens than the national government, because state governments are closer to the people than the national government. Note that this system served in a fashion similar to the Electoral College, whereby smaller cities had a larger per capita voice than their big city rivals. As it stands now, Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area drive the entirety of California's politics. The people elected their state legislature, who appointed members of the Senate, and the people elected members of the House, who can act as checks on the Senate. The people would watch the state legislatures, and the state legislatures would watch the Senate. This falls into line with the principle of one voice, one vote, whereby entities are represented only once at each level of government: citizens through the House, states through the Senate. The Constitution sought to diffuse power wherever it was able, and was structured to push power down governmental levels towards the people, not away from them. Citizens were directly represented by the House, states were directly represented by the Senate. Both were naturally aligned against an overbearing federal government. Congress was originally created to be an arena for competition between citizens, states, and national governments' competing interests. The congressional structure was specifically and thoughtfully put in place to protect states and individuals against power consolidation by the national government. It was one of the greatest barriers to undue increases in power and size of the federal government. It's in direct response to the passage of the 17th Amendment that the federal government began its exponential growth. The primary brake on federal government expansion was removed. Senators were no longer beholden to states. They were now beholden to the federal government. Senators became incentivized to promote unchecked growth of the federal system because senators were now part of the federal system. The state's ability to resist the federal government was gone overnight. And as citizens, so was ours. The 17th Amendment should be repealed for the good of citizens, for the good of states, and for the good of our nation. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, "In questions of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution." Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Truth Over News.